Came down in sheets that afternoon, turning the sidewalks into rivers and the sky into something gray and unforgiving. James Carter sat in his wheelchair beneath the overhang of a coffee shop, waiting for his sister to bring the car around. He didn't mind the wait. These days, waiting was all he did. Waiting for physical therapy appointments that wouldn't give him his legs back, waiting for the VA calls that never seemed to solve anything, waiting for a purpose that had died in the flames of a warehouse halfway across the world. He pulled his jacket tighter and watched the rain blur the streets. That's when he saw it, a shape huddled against the glass of a bus stop across the street. At first, he thought it was a pile of rags, something discarded and forgotten, but then it moved, slowly, painfully. A dog, soaked to the bone, ribs pressing against matted fur, trembling so hard James could see it even from a distance. Something twisted in his chest. He wheeled himself to the edge of the curb, squinting through the rain. The dog was a German shepherd, or what was left of one. Its coat was caked in mud and streaked with scars, burns, old ones, healed wrong, without care, without treatment. The dog's head rested on its paws, eyes half closed, like it had given up on everything except the faint warmth of the bus stop glass. James's breath caught. There was something about the way the dog held itself, the angle of its ears, the shape of its muzzle, the way its front paws crossed slightly, even in exhaustion, a habit James had seen 1,000 times before. He told himself he was imagining things, told himself grief did that to a man, made him see ghosts in every shadow, every stray, every empty space that used to be filled. But his hands were already moving, wheeling him forward into the rain. "Shadow," he whispered. The dog's ear twitched. James's heart slammed against his ribs. He said it again, louder this time, his voice cracking. "Shadow!" The dog lifted its head, slowly, like it took every ounce of strength left in its broken body. And when those eyes, those amber eyes James had looked into 1,000 times in the desert, in the dirt, in the chaos of war, met his, the world stopped. The dog tried to stand. Its legs buckled. It collapsed back down, whining, trembling. But its tail, God, its tail was wagging, weak, desperate, but wagging. James crossed the street without thinking, rain soaking through his clothes, his wheelchair splashing through puddles. He didn't care. He reached the bus stop and dropped out of his chair onto the wet pavement, dragging himself forward until he was close enough to touch. "Shadow," he breathed, his hands hovering over the dog's head. "Is it really you?" Shadow's nose pressed into James's palm, and the scent, even through the mud and the rain and the suffering, was familiar. Home, family, brother. A sound came from deep in the dog's throat, half whimper, half cry, and James broke. He pulled Shadow into his arms, feeling every bone, every scar, every inch of suffering his partner had endured. The dog was a skeleton, starving, dying, but alive. Impossibly, miraculously alive. "I thought you were gone," James sobbed into Shadow's neck. "I thought I lost you. I thought—" Shadow licked his face, weak, slow, but real. James's sister found them like that, soldier and dog, both broken, both clinging to each other in the rain like the world might rip them apart again if they let go. 18 months earlier, James Carter was a different man. He stood 6'2", carried a rifle like it was part of his arm, and moved through combat zones with the kind of confidence that came from years of training and dozens of missions that should have killed him, but didn't. He was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army, assigned to a specialized unit that didn't show up in newspapers or get mentioned at dinner tables back home. The kind of unit that handled the missions no one else wanted to touch. And beside him, always, was Shadow. Shadow wasn't just any military working dog. From the first day of handler training, the instructors knew. The dog was different, faster, sharper. He didn't just obey commands, he anticipated them. During the initial bonding exercises, while other handlers spent weeks building trust with their dogs, Shadow and James clicked within hours. The dog followed James everywhere, refused to work with other handlers, and showed an almost eerie ability to read his partner's intentions. In one training exercise, instructors hid explosives in a mock village setup. Shadow found all 12 devices in under 10 minutes, a record that still stood at the facility. But what stunned everyone was the 13th device, the one the instructors hadn't planted yet. Shadow sat down in front of a building and refused to move. When they checked, they found an old training charge from a previous exercise, forgotten and buried. The instructors looked at each other, looked at Shadow. The dog wasn't just trained, he was gifted. But to James, Shadow was perfect. They bonded in a way that went beyond training. Shadow slept beside James's bunk every night, his breathing synchronized with his handlers. He followed James everywhere, to the mess hall, to briefings, even to the latrine if James let him. Off-duty, Shadow was gentle, almost goofy, playing with a ratty tennis ball James kept in his pack. He'd rest his massive head on James's knee during movie nights, drooling on his combat pants. The other soldiers joked that Shadow was more loyal than most wives. On duty, he was a weapon, a guardian, a brother in fur who had saved James's life more times than either of them could count. Their first real deployment together was to a region so hostile that command didn't use its actual name in briefings. They just called it the Zone. James and Shadow were assigned to a forward operating base where IEDs were the leading cause of casualties. Their job was simple: walk ahead of patrols and find the bombs before the bombs found the soldiers. Shadow excelled. He detected pressure plates buried under gravel roads. He alerted to tripwires hidden in doorways. He found explosive vests in abandoned cars and artillery shells rigged to detonate in marketplace stalls. Every detection meant lives saved. Every mission meant someone's husband, someone's son, someone's father made it home. Together, they cleared compounds rigged with explosives, their movements coordinated like a dance they'd practiced 1,000 times. James would signal, Shadow would move. Shadow would alert, James would respond. No hesitation, no doubt, pure trust. They walked point on patrols through hostile villages where every window could hide a sniper and every pile of trash could hide a bomb. Shadow's nose worked constantly, his body tense, his focus absolute. The other soldiers trusted Shadow more than their own gear. They joked that if Shadow said a road was clear, they'd walk it blindfolded. James didn't joke. He knew. Shadow wasn't following training protocols anymore. He was protecting his handler, his pack, his family. One scorching afternoon, during a routine patrol through a market district, Shadow stopped mid-step, his ears pinned back. A low growl rumbled in his chest. James raised his fist immediately, halting the entire patrol. 15 soldiers froze. Shadow's eyes were locked on a fruit cart 20 meters ahead. The vendor had abandoned it minutes earlier, unusual but not unheard of in a combat zone. James approached slowly, weapon raised. Shadow stayed glued to his left side, every muscle coiled. As they got closer, Shadow's growl intensified. James trusted that sound more than any intelligence report. He signaled the patrol back, called in the bomb disposal unit, and evacuated the area. The disposal team found 40 pounds of explosives packed under the fruit cart, rigged to a cell phone detonator. Someone had been watching, waiting for the patrol to gather close. If Shadow hadn't alerted, if James hadn't listened, 15 American soldiers would have died in that market. That night, back at the base, James sat with Shadow under the stars and fed him an entire pack of beef jerky, contraband he'd been saving for a special occasion. Shadow ate it slowly, savoring each piece, his tail thumping against the dusty ground. James scratched behind the dog's ears and whispered, "You saved us today, buddy. You saved all of us." Shadow just rested his head on James's lap, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like saving lives was just part of the job, like protecting his handler was all that mattered. Another time, during a night raid on a suspected insurgent safe house, the team breached a compound and began clearing rooms. James and Shadow took the left corridor, while the rest of the squad went right. They moved through darkness, James's night vision painting the world in shades of green, Shadow's senses painting it in scent and sound. Shadow stopped at a doorway, whined, backed up. James knew that sound. Danger. He signaled the team to hold. They stacked explosives on the door and blew it remotely. The explosion triggered a secondary blast inside. The entire room had been rigged to detonate when the door opened. If they'd breached manually, if Shadow hadn't warned them, James and 2 other soldiers would have been vaporized. After that mission, the squad started calling Shadow the Guardian. They brought him extra food from the mess hall, snuck him pieces of chicken and steak. One of the younger privates even gave Shadow his lucky bandana, tying it around the dog's neck like a medal. Shadow wore it on every mission after that, a red strip of cloth that became his trademark. But the bond between James and Shadow went deeper than missions and medals. It was the quiet moments that defined them. The way Shadow would sense when James was having a bad day and stay closer than usual. The way he'd rest his paw on James's boot during briefings, a silent reminder that he was there. The way his tail would wag, just slightly, when James's voice came over the radio during operations, even when they were separated by buildings and walls. At night, when mortars fell on the base and explosions lit up the sky, Shadow didn't flinch. He'd sit between James's legs, calm and steady, like his presence alone could shield his handler from the chaos. And in a way, it did, because as long as Shadow was there, James knew he wasn't facing the war alone. Then came the warehouse mission. Intelligence reported a weapons cache in a remote industrial zone, explosives, ammunition, materials for IEDs that were killing soldiers daily. The mission was supposed to be simple. Get in, confirm the cache, call in demolition experts, get out. James and Shadow went in first, as always. The warehouse was dark, filled with rusted machinery and stacks of crates that cast long shadows in their flashlight beams. Shadow moved ahead, nose working, body tense. His ears swiveled, tracking sounds James couldn't hear. They cleared the first room, then the second. Everything felt wrong. The air too still, the building too quiet. Then Shadow stopped. His ears pinned flat against his head. A growl, low, urgent, dangerous, rumbled in his chest. James raised his fist immediately, signaling the team to hold. They stacked explosives on the door and blew it remotely. The explosion triggered a secondary blast inside. The entire room had been rigged to detonate when the door opened. If they'd breached manually, if Shadow hadn't warned them, James and 2 other soldiers would have been vaporized. His boot came down. The explosion was instant, blinding, a wall of fire and concussive force that lifted James off his feet and hurled him backward into steel scaffolding. He felt his spine shatter on impact, vertebrae compressing and fracturing in ways that would change his life forever. Felt his legs go numb, all sensation cutting off below his waist like someone had severed a wire. Felt the heat sear his skin and the ringing in his ears drown out everything else, except one sound. Shadow barking, desperate, frantic, trying to reach him through the flames. James tried to move, couldn't. His lungs were full of smoke and dust. The world was spinning, burning, collapsing around him. He heard voices, his team shouting, dragging him backward across broken concrete. He heard the roar of the fire spreading through the warehouse. He heard the groan of metal beams buckling overhead. And he heard Shadow, still barking, still fighting to get to him. James reached out with one hand, toward the sound, toward his partner. "Shadow!" He tried to scream, but nothing came out, just blood and smoke. Then the ceiling came down. Steel beams and concrete slabs crashed into the space where James had been seconds before. His team dragged him through the doorway just as the structure collapsed inward, a cascading failure that buried everything inside under tons of rubble. The last thing James saw before losing consciousness was the warehouse consumed by fire, flames reaching toward the night sky like claws. And then he didn't hear Shadow anymore. They found James unconscious outside the warehouse, pulled clear by his team. His spine was fractured in 3 places, T11, T12, and L1. His legs were unresponsive, the nerve damage catastrophic and irreversible. The medics said he was lucky to be alive, lucky to have survived the explosion, lucky his team had gotten him out. James didn't feel lucky. He felt like half of him had been left behind in the fire. Search and rescue teams combed the wreckage for hours. The fire burned too hot to approach at first, forcing them to wait until dawn. When they finally went in, they found bodies, enemy combatants who'd been guarding the cache. They found weapons, crates full of explosives and ammunition. They found the twisted remains of the pressure plate that had triggered the blast. They found nothing alive. No trace of Shadow, no body, no collar, no sign he'd ever existed except for the memories of the men who'd served with him. The explosion had been catastrophic, the fire intense enough to melt steel. Command made the only logical conclusion. Shadow was declared KIA, killed in action. They told James the explosion had been catastrophic, that the temperatures had reached thousands of degrees, that no living thing could have survived, that Shadow had died doing what he was trained to do, protecting his handler. They gave James a folded flag at the memorial service, gave him a certificate with Shadow's name and service number, gave him condolences and handshakes and words that meant nothing because they couldn't bring Shadow back. James didn't believe them, not because the facts didn't make sense, but because accepting it meant accepting that Shadow had died trying to save him, that his best friend, his brother, had barked for him in the flames, and James had been too broken to answer, that Shadow's last moments had been spent trying to reach the one person who was supposed to protect him. The guilt was worse than the paralysis. Recovery was slow and brutal. James spent months in military hospitals, enduring surgeries that put titanium rods in his spine and therapy that taught him how to live in a wheelchair. Physical therapists pushed him to regain upper body strength. Occupational therapists taught him how to dress himself, how to transfer from bed to chair, how to navigate a world designed for people who could walk. Psychologists tried to help him process the trauma, tried to get him to talk about the explosion, about Shadow, about the guilt that ate at him every waking moment. James refused. What was there to say? That he'd failed his partner? That Shadow had trusted him and James had led him into a death trap? That every night he heard that desperate barking in his dreams and woke up reaching for a dog that wasn't there? He was medically discharged with honors, given a Purple Heart for his injuries, given a pension and benefits, and thanked for his service, then sent home, to a country that appreciated his sacrifice but didn't know what to do with a broken soldier who'd lost more than his legs. James moved into a small house his sister helped him find, single-story, wheelchair accessible, close to the VA hospital. She visited often, brought groceries, helped with things he couldn't manage alone. She tried to make him smile, tried to pull him out of the darkness that had settled over him like a shroud. But James was a ghost. He went through the motions, physical therapy appointments where he pushed weights and did exercises that wouldn't give him his legs back. VA appointments where doctors asked how he was coping, and he lied and said fine. Sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, replaying the explosion, hearing Shadow's bark echo in the silence. Shadow's leash still hung by the door, exactly where James had left it before deploying. His food bowl sat in the corner of the kitchen, untouched, still half full of kibble from the morning they'd shipped out. James couldn't bring himself to move them, couldn't pack them away, because doing that would make it final, would mean accepting that Shadow was never coming back. At night, he heard Shadow's bark in his dreams, saw those amber eyes looking at him through the smoke, woke up with his hand outstretched, reaching for a presence that wasn't there. The emptiness in the house was suffocating. No clicking of nails on hardwood floors, no jingling of tags, no warm weight pressed against his leg while he sat on the couch. Everyone told him he needed to move on, that Shadow had been a working dog, not a pet, that he'd done his job and died honorably, that James should be proud of the lives they'd saved together and not dwell on the one life he couldn't save. But James didn't want honor. He didn't want pride. He wanted his partner back. Wanted to hear Shadow's tail thump against the floor when he came home. Wanted to feel that cold nose press into his palm when he was having a bad day. Wanted his brother back. The war was over for James Carter, but the battle inside him never stopped.
That rainy afternoon at the bus stop felt like a hallucination. Even as James held Shadow in his arms, even as his sister pulled up and they rushed to lift the dog into the back seat, James kept waiting to wake up, kept waiting for reality to correct itself and reveal this was just another cruel dream. But Shadow was real. His weight was real. His heartbeat was real. Broken, starving, scarred, but real. James's sister drove like the devil himself was chasing them, running red lights and laying on the horn. James sat in the back with Shadow's head in his lap, stroking the dog's matted fur and whispering promises. "I've got you. I've got you. You're safe now. I'm here." Shadow's eyes stayed open, fixed on James's face, like he was afraid if he looked away, his handler would disappear again. The veterinary clinic was chaos. The receptionist took one look at Shadow and immediately called for help. 2 vet techs rushed out with a stretcher, but Shadow growled when they tried to touch him, weak, barely audible, but defensive. "It's okay, buddy," James said, his voice breaking. "They're going to help you. Let them help you." Shadow's growl faded. He let the techs lift him onto the stretcher, but his eyes never left James. The head veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Ellison with kind eyes and a gray hair pulled back in a bun, took one look at Shadow and her professional demeanor cracked. "My God," she whispered, "what happened to him?" "War," James said simply. They took Shadow into the examination room. Dr. Ellison worked quickly, her hands gentle despite the urgency. She checked vitals, drew blood, started an IV line. Shadow didn't fight, didn't snap, just lay there, trembling, his eyes tracking James through the doorway. After 30 minutes, Dr. Ellison came out. Her face was grave. "I need you to understand," she said, pulling James aside. "This dog is in critical condition, severe malnutrition. He's lost at least 40% of his body weight, dehydration, multiple infected wounds. These burns, they're old, healed without treatment. His organs are shutting down. His body is literally consuming itself to survive." James's hands gripped the wheels of his chair so hard his knuckles went white. "Can you save him?" She hesitated. "I don't know how he's even alive right now. The next 48 hours are critical. We'll do everything we can, but you need to prepare yourself for the possibility." "No," James said firmly. "He didn't survive this long to die now. He didn't—" His voice broke. "He came back to me. He found me. You have to save him." Dr. Ellison looked at this broken soldier, tears streaming down his face, and nodded. "We'll do everything we can." They took Shadow into surgery. James waited.
Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. His sister brought him coffee he didn't drink, brought him food he didn't touch. She tried to talk to him, tried to offer comfort, but James couldn't hear her. All he could hear was Shadow's bark in that warehouse. All he could see was the flames. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Ellison emerged. She looked exhausted, her scrubs stained, her eyes red. She's stable, for now, but he's not out of the woods. The next 48 hours are critical. If he makes it through tonight, his chances improve significantly. "Can I see him?" She nodded. They brought James into the recovery room. Shadow lay on a padded table, hooked up to IV lines and monitors that beeped steadily. His breathing was shallow but regular. His eyes were closed. He looked so small, so fragile, nothing like the powerful guardian who'd walked point through war zones and saved countless lives. James wheeled himself close and placed his hand on Shadow's head, careful to avoid the bandages. "Hey, buddy, I'm here. I'm right here. You're safe now. You found me. You actually found me, you stubborn, incredible dog." Shadow's eyes opened, just a sliver, just enough, and his heart rate, displayed on the monitor above, steadied. The erratic beeping that had been fluctuating wildly suddenly evened out. The numbers stabilized. His breathing deepened, became more regular. Dr. Ellison, watching from the doorway, shook her head in disbelief. "That's not medically possible," she murmured. "His vitals were all over the place. Now they're stabilizing, just from hearing your voice." But it was happening. Shadow's body, which had been fighting a losing battle against shutdown and death, suddenly found a reason to keep fighting. Not because of the medicine, not because of the surgery, because his soldier was finally beside him again. Over the next week, Shadow fought. The odds were stacked against him. The veterinary staff prepared James multiple times for the worst. Infections spiked, fevers raged. There were moments when Shadow's vitals crashed and alarms screamed, and James thought he was going to lose his partner all over again. But every time, Shadow pulled through. Every time, he chose to fight. James never left. He slept in his wheelchair beside Shadow's recovery kennel. He talked to Shadow constantly about their missions, about the soldiers they'd saved, about the life they'd have when Shadow recovered. He read to him from paperback novels, played music on his phone, anything to let Shadow know he wasn't alone. The veterinary staff started to believe, started to hope. Shadow began eating small amounts, started drinking on his own. The infections cleared, the wounds began to close, and one morning, when James arrived after a brief trip home to shower and change, Shadow lifted his head and his tail thumped against the blanket. Not much, just a few weak thumps, but it was everything. Dr. Ellison told James what she'd pieced together from Shadow's injuries and condition. The explosion had thrown him clear of the worst of the blast, probably through a window or gap in the warehouse wall. He'd been burned, but not fatally, injured but mobile enough to escape the collapse. Then he'd wandered, for months, maybe longer, across unimaginable distance. His paws were scarred from walking on broken ground. His body showed signs of living rough, eating scraps, drinking from puddles, sleeping wherever he could find shelter. He'd survived attacks from other animals. Some of his wounds were clearly bite marks. He'd endured weather, hunger, pain. All of it alone. Injured, with no guarantee he'd ever find what he was looking for. But he'd kept moving, kept searching, guided by something deeper than training, deeper than instinct. He'd been trying to find James. A dog declared dead, a dog with no way of knowing where his handler had gone, no scent trail to follow across an ocean and a continent, a dog who should have died a dozen times over from his injuries alone. But he hadn't, because loyalty doesn't die in the fire, because some bonds are stronger than steel and deeper than blood. because Shadow wasn't just a military working dog.
He was a soldier, a brother, a guardian who'd made a promise the day he and James bonded, a promise that transcended training and duty. And soldiers don't abandon their brothers. Not in war, not in peace, not ever. 3 weeks later, James brought Shadow home. The dog was still thin, still healing, still moving carefully on legs that had walked through hell. But his eyes were bright again. His tail wagged when James spoke. And when they crossed the threshold of James's house, and Shadow saw his old bowl still sitting in the corner, exactly where it had been 18 months ago, he walked over to it and sat down, waiting, like no time had passed at all, like he'd never left. James broke down, again, but this time it wasn't grief, it wasn't guilt, it was gratitude, it was relief. It was the overwhelming, crushing realization that he wasn't alone anymore, that the war had taken his legs, his career, his sense of purpose, but it hadn't taken everything. Shadow rested his head on James's lap, and for the first time in over a year, James felt whole. The nights were different now. When the memories came, and they still came, vivid and brutal, James would reach down and feel Shadow's warmth beside his bed, would hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, would know that his brother had survived, that they'd both survived. Shadow slept with that same red bandana around his neck, the one the young private had given him all those months ago. James had found it among Shadow's belongings at the base, shipped home with the rest of his gear after he was declared KIA. Now it was back where it belonged. Some days were hard. Shadow still had nightmares, would wake up whimpering, trembling, lost in whatever hell his mind had taken him to. James would talk him through it, his voice calm and steady, until Shadow remembered where he was, who he was with, that he was safe. Other days were good. James started taking Shadow to the VA hospital with him, and something amazing happened. Other veterans, men and women carrying their own invisible wounds, would stop to pet Shadow, would ask about him. And in those conversations, James found himself talking about the war, about the missions, about the bond between handler and dog. He found himself healing. Shadow became a therapy dog, certified and official. He visited other wounded warriors, resting his head on their laps, letting them find comfort in his presence. The dog who'd saved lives in combat was still saving lives at home. One afternoon, James received a call from his old unit. They'd heard about Shadow, heard about the impossible reunion. They wanted to know if James and Shadow would accept an invitation to a military ceremony honoring working dogs. James said yes. At the ceremony, Shadow walked onto the stage beside James's wheelchair, wearing a new vest with his military insignia and his medals. The crowd, hundreds of soldiers, veterans, and families, rose in a standing ovation, not just for Shadow, for all the working dogs who'd served, for all the bonds forged in combat, for all the warriors, two-legged and four-legged, who'd given everything for each other. That night, back home, James sat with Shadow under the stars in his backyard, the same stars they'd sat under in that desert all those months ago, after Shadow had saved 15 lives at that market. "We made it, buddy," James said, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "We actually made it." Shadow's tail thumped against the ground, slow, content, home. Some warriors wear uniforms and carry rifles into battle. Some walk on 4 legs and detect danger before it strikes. But all of them share one unbreakable truth. Loyalty forged in combat doesn't fade when the mission ends. It doesn't die in explosions or get left behind in the rubble.
It survives, it endures, it crosses impossible distances and defies every odd because that's what brothers do.
Shadow didn't survive because he was trained to. He survived because love, real, unshakable, unconditional love, is stronger than war, stronger than fire, stronger than death itself. And James learned that even when you think everything is lost, even when the darkness feels permanent and the guilt threatens to consume you, sometimes the thing you need most finds its way back to you, scarred, broken, but alive, still fighting, still loyal, still yours. Because some promises are made without words. Some bonds don't need contracts or ceremonies. They're forged in trust and sealed in sacrifice, and they don't break. Not in war, not in peace, not ever. If this story reminded you that courage isn't just about fighting, it's about never giving up on the ones who never gave up on you, we honor the warriors who proved that loyalty isn't just a word, it's a promise, a covenant, a bond stronger than steel and deeper than any wound. Shadow crossed hell itself to keep his promise. He walked through fire, survived the impossible, and found his way home against odds that would have broken anything less than pure, devoted love. Stay strong, stay loyal, and never forget, the greatest battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with heart. Sometimes they're fought with faith. Sometimes they're fought by refusing to give up, even when the whole world says it's over. Because it's not over until you come home. And home isn't a place, it's the person or the partner who never stopped waiting for you. Welcome home, Shadow. Welcome.